It's 2:06 Central Time. This event is being recorded, just so everybody knows. So I think we're going to get started. So welcome to Yidn, Kegn, Fascism, Jews Against Fascism, a discussion with Joe Butwin about his book Salud Ish Shalom, Conversations with Jewish Veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. My name is Ben Schacht. I'm a member of the board of the Chicago YIVO Society. The Chicago YIVO Society, for those who may not be familiar with it, is an all-volunteer organization whose mission is to entertain and educate the local community through subsidized lectures, music programs, film screenings, and the like, which reflect the rich heritage and diversity of Jewish culture, and to ensure the future of Yiddish through language education. You can take Yiddish language classes through Chicago YIVO. You can learn more about that on our website. And the Chicago YIVO Society is a local affiliate of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. YIVO stands for Yiddischer Wissenschaftlicher Institut, founded in 1925 in Vilna, now Vilnius, Lithuania, and based in New York City since 1940. YIVO is the world's preeminent resource for East European Jewish studies, Yiddish language, literature, and folklore, and the American Jewish immigrant experience. Founded in 1925, it's 2025, so it's YIVO's 100th anniversary this year. All of the programs that we put on are free to the public, but they do cost time, money, and effort to organize. So if you like today's program, please consider making a donation to the Chicago YIVO Society. You can do that on our website, chicagoyivo.org, where you can also learn about our upcoming events. I want to mention just two events that are happening this month. On Thursday, November 13th at the University of Chicago, join us for an evening of Yiddish songs of social change with the Golden Thread Ensemble. And from November 14th to 16th, visit the first ever Midwest Yiddish Fest, which is taking place in Champaign-Urbana, just a couple hours down the road from Chicago. The festival will feature live music, cooking, printmaking, workshops, Yiddish 101, children's story time, scholarly lectures, and much more. So if you're in the Chicago area, we hope to see you at one or both of those events. And now it is my great privilege and pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Joe Butwin. Joe is Associate Professor Emeritus of English and Jewish Studies at the University of Washington. He's a wide-ranging scholar with many interests who has published on everything from Charles Dickens and George Eliot to Sholem Aleichem. And most recently, and most importantly for us today, he is the author of Salud Ish Shalom, Conversations with Jewish Veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which was published earlier this year by University of Illinois Press. And before I hand it over to Joe to talk about his book, I do want to say a couple words about this remarkable book, which I have right here. Salud Ish Shalom is one of several recent books that have been devoted to the subject of Jewish and Yiddish engagement with the Spanish Civil War. In 2024, White Goat Press, the imprint of the Yiddish Book Center, published Deborah Green's translation of Journey Through the Spanish Civil War by S.L. Schneiderman. It's a journalistic account of the war that's written in Yiddish. And in fact, Joe wrote a review of Deborah Green's translation, which was published in The Volunteer, the Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives. And in 2020, Amelia Glazer published Songs in Dark Times, Yiddish Poetry of Struggle from Scottsboro to Palestine, which contains a really interesting chapter devoted to Yiddish poets in the Spanish Civil War. What makes Joe's book stand out, in my opinion, is its autobiographical nature. In reading his book, we get to hear directly from the American Jews who fought in the Spanish Civil War. And as Joe pointed out to me in one of our conversations, no other recent book about Jews in the Spanish Civil War can do this because the veterans of the war are no longer here to share their experiences. Joe was fortunate to record their voices in the 1990s when the veterans were in their 80s. And because Joe talked with the veterans more than 50 years after the end of the war, we get to hear them reflect on how the war fit into the broader sweep of their lives. As Joe has emphasized to me in our conversations, these aren't just Spanish Civil War stories, these are life stories, and as such, they're an incredibly rich source of first-person historical testimony. So with that, I want to hand the microphone over to Joe, and I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation that we've put together, and I'm going to give the floor to him. Thank you very much.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank the organization, Chicago YIVO, and particularly Ben Schacht, who invited me to show up today, um, but not off the top. In other words, my showing up is a result of several months back and forth of a conversation that will continue today. I've gotten to know Ben and respect his knowledge, which has what can I say? Stimulated my own. I reread a book that I wrote in a new light, thinking it over for what we might discuss today. First of all, let's be clear about the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 39. Spain in 1936 had only recently become a republic. They had sloughed off an archaic monarchy in 1931. King Alfonso was sent out. And in 1936, what we might call a center-left coalition associated with the Popular Front, the Global Popular Front, won a national election in Spain. I say center-left because it's not clear that they were that far, say, from Roosevelt's New Deal at the same time. On some issues, probably to the right of Roosevelt. Nonetheless, the old Spanish establishment that had sustained the monarchy for so long was furious at the electoral victory, furious at the fact of an election at all. That Spanish establishment easily identified the army, the Catholic Church, big landowners, enlisted or were enlisted by certain activist generals, most notably in the army, most notably Francisco Franco, who had been semi-exiled to Morocco by the Spanish Republic, returned with a vengeance in July of 1936 and launched what is variously called a rebellion against the Spanish Republic. He immediately, I mean within days, 2 days, sought the help of Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany, and he got help. His troops were flown from North Africa to Spain in German planes within days. Germany sent men and material, and an even larger Italian army soon entered what became not exactly a global war, but definitely a prologue to a global war. Meanwhile, the Western democracies, most notably England and France and the United States, very piously signed a non-intervention pact. The US had already written, in anticipation of events like this, a Neutrality Act in 1935. Result, Western democracies, so to speak, did not jump to the aid of their brothers and sisters in Spain, Spanish Republic. The only countries, oh, I should add, incidentally, that some enterprises in the United States did manage to break the embargo, but only for Franco. Texaco and Ford sold on credit to Franco's army. Meanwhile, the only international aid that the Spanish Republic received came to some degree from Mexico, but to a much greater degree from the Soviet Union. The USSR, Stalin's Russia, by whatever name, sent mostly material aid, much of it to begin with antiquated, eventually more sophisticated rifles and and eventually fighter planes, very few people. Instead, the Comintern, the so-called, the Communist International, calling itself the Comintern, keyword international, organized globally an international brigade, or international brigade, plural, that came from really all over the world, most notably and quickly, and quite naturally, from Europe, east and west. International brigades began to enter Spain as early, remember the war begins in July of 36, as early as November, when Franco's forces were really at the gates of Madrid. International brigades helped to defend in the defense of Madrid. We all know, or many people know, the slogan of those days, no pasarán, they will not pass. And for the time, they didn't pass. An American International Brigade, generally known as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. I could explain what I mean by generally known, but let's accept that as the common name for the Americans in Spain, began to arrive by December and early 1937. Now, who were the brigadistas, as they were called in Spain? About 2,800 Americans, most of them very young, within, from 20 to 25, while most of the international brigades coming from Poland or France, Belgium, and Britain were older workers, some of them veterans of the First World War. The Americans were young, from a military point of view, inexperienced, most of them members of the Communist Party, answering the call of the Comintern. Most, but not all, I might say, members of the Communist Party. Of the 2,800 Americans, fully 1/3 were Jewish. And that was true across the board, sometimes more than a third coming out of Poland, Germany, France, or Belgium, where many of the brigadistas were recent arrivals from Eastern Europe. If there was an international language in Spain among the international brigades, it wasn't Spanish, wasn't Russian, wasn't English or German, but Yiddish. I'll have more to say about that down the line. Now, I grew up, let's say, with the lore of the Spanish Civil War very vivid in the household where I began. The books, the records, the pictures on the wall, all revived a recollection of Spain. I should say that I was born in 1943, so that you might, in the afterglow of the Popular Front of the 1930s and 40s, my first, what can I say, anything close to research, my first-hand, second-hand knowledge of Spain, of the Spanish Civil War, in any detail beyond the songs and the pictures, came with a reading of Ernest Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls. What you're looking at on the screen right now is a rather tattered first edition, which I'll have more to say in a few minutes, of the book that came out in 1940. I should say that it was one of the first books that I read that didn't have pictures. I was 14 years old. I remember sitting through a few days of rain on the front porch when you couldn't play baseball in St. Paul, 1958. What would I have known of the war from Hemingway? I won't go into detail about Hemingway's representation of the war, apart from the fact that its central figure, well known and even better known when he was portrayed by Gary Cooper of Helena, Montana, a few years after the book came out, is Robert Jordan, who is not exactly a member of the International Brigade. He functions alone behind the lines. But what I would have absorbed of Robert Jordan often comes in the fact that he delivers rather long monologues to himself. He talks to himself a lot. At one point, I'll just pluck words from a passage. He compares his political passion to his first communion, a feeling of consecration, religious experience, and the thrill he feels in the architecture of a Chartres Cathedral, the Cathedral at León in Spain, when he looks at certain paintings in Prado and Madrid. The war, he says, was a crusade. I want that word to echo a bit, all those words. There is, how shall I say, not an iota of Yiddishkeit in Robert Jordan, and there didn't need to be. He was a Hemingway hero, and for a few years he was certainly my hero, and to some degree my father's before me. My parents were running a bookstore in St. Paul at the time that Hemingway's novel came out in October 1940. And when the record album on your screen, 6 Songs for Democracy, recorded in Barcelona in 1938, and incidentally, in those recordings, the most vivid part for me when I was a child wasn't so much the songs, all of them in foreign languages, I might say, international, but the reverberation of gunfire, of cannon in the background. There's a little apology for that written into the album, that on the days of recording, they just couldn't obscure the fact that the war was about to enter Barcelona. My father wrote on the weekend that when Hemingway's novel arrived in the shop, and incidentally, the shop then as now would get the book before it was officially on the market. So he had a weekend to read it, and did. And at the end of the weekend, wrote to my mother, who was out of town at the time, and therefore I have the record of that event. He writes, "The songs of democracy came today. I just played them. They affected me more powerfully than Red Army songs, maybe because of the circumstances. The Red Army is the Red Army, but the International Brigade is something else. Somehow, I can always become sentimental at the thought of that crowd. There certainly has been nothing like it since the Crusade. But what the hell is a crusade compared to that?" So Time magazine was big at the time. Time manages to spit at the brigade, even in their review of Hemingway's book. I want one thing to be clear. When my father says Red Army songs, it's because he had those too. My parents had joined the Communist Party in 1935, right at the high tide of the Popular Front that would draw together left and left-leaning parties to create the International Brigades a few years later. It was, in other words, not exactly a revolutionary communist party that they joined. It was a party that could make alliances with the New Deal around Social Security and such, and with definitely with the Spanish Republic. At the same time, my father would have been reading Sholem Aleichem in the Yiddish edition that was distributed by the Morgen Freiheit, the communist Yiddish newspaper, which my parents had bought for one of my grandfathers shortly before. The collected Sholem Aleichem came with the subscription. They kept the Sholem Aleichem and left my grandfather scratching his head over the Morgen Freiheit. By 1943, late 43, the year that I was born, they were translating stories of Sholem Aleichem that came out as in a book called The Old Country in 1946, in the summer of 1946. By that time, my father had died late in 1945. He didn't see the publication that had taken up his passionate attention in the last year of his life. And yet, the passionate partisan of the Spanish Republic, the Communist Party, and the translator of Sholem Aleichem, I never had a chance to talk to my father, although I've read his letters. I have a strong sense that he would not have necessarily made a bridge or a connection between his degree of Yiddishkeit, born in Russia, native speaker of Yiddish, and a writer and translator of that language. I don't think that he would have necessarily made the connections that I'm at least entertaining today between his Yiddishkeit and his partisanship in Spain. We'll see where we can go with that. When you meet the members of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and if we could show in this well-known photograph that I certainly knew growing up, looked at, stared at the long line of soldiers with a kind of thrill and admiration without exactly knowing who they were, what they were after. We see members of the brigade in Catalonia, 1938. The photograph was taken by the great Robert Capa, who was incidentally a Hungarian Jew. And the leadership of the battalion at that point are the three men in the foreground. Donald Fair in uniform on stage left. Milt Wolf, who was the commander at the age of 23, incidentally. Consider that. The tall, ambling guy without in mufti, without military uniform in the middle, and George Watt at his side. In short, Wolf and Watt, both Jews, and that represents not just the 1/3 Jewish membership, but the 2/3 of the leadership of the battalion. I met both men, as Ben suggested, about 50 years later in San Francisco, in the case of Milt Wolf, out on Long Island with George Watt in 1992. George told me right away something of his readiness to talk to me about Jews in the Lincoln Brigade and about his own Jewishness. He said that he had been at Yad Vashem, the memorial of the Holocaust, in Israel, and listened while a guide talked about Jewish resistance during the war, focusing on Warsaw and Vilna, 1942, 43, but leaving unspoken what George knew of Jewish resistance before the outbreak of the Second World War in Spain. When we spoke, he immediately recalled his own lineage, and I think that's an important notion throughout all of my conversations. Really was that people didn't seem to need to begin their life story in their own time. There seemed to be a compulsion to talk. It would be as if you met one of the biblical patriarchs who would constantly have to remind you of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The generations filled the room, and certainly my cassette tape recorder. In this case, George showed me a photo that includes his grandfather as a leader of a strike in Lodz, and we can listen to the intonation, but also to the way in which stories are told. The recitation of a familial legend doesn't mean it's not true, but it's treated with all of the reverence that goes into Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Listen to the testament.
Can everybody hear the audio okay? I just want to make sure.
I can't right now.
Okay, I think it's because I was muted. I'm going to start again. Sorry about that.
Yeah, we still don't hear it. Maybe are you sharing your audio too? Sometimes you have to make sure you're sharing audio and
all right. Sorry for the technical difficulties. How would I share my audio?
I think it's in Zoom. You have to, like, where you're sharing, you have to click that you're to share.
All right.
That's maybe an advanced sharing option or something. If you click the arrow next to share.
I can click and pretend if need be.
Well, if you give me 1 second, we should be able to get it. Advanced sharing options.
And I don't see there, or maybe usually it was working before. So I don't know. Sometimes, or maybe when you start sharing, it will ask if you want to share audio.
Let's see. Share sound. Okay. Oh my God, it's making me enter a password.
Do you want me to perform?
Right. You can try again. Hold on.
Ever since as long as I can remember, there was a legend in our family around my grandfather, my father's father. My father's father.
Good, everybody can hear that?
Yes.
Was was a textile worker, a weaver. in Lodz. And he worked in a factory which was owned by a Jewish boss. And his factory was the place where they had the first strike of Jewish workers in Lodz in 1903, the Schlitzky factory in Lodz. And ever since I was a kid, that my father told the story, which was part of our family tradition. He was not a rabbi, but he was considered very learned, and he was called Avremel Langenbod, or Avremel the Lamden. Abraham, you know Yiddish, of course, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Enough.
He was known as the Lamden, and he was one of the elder workers in the plant, who became active in this strike, and he was one of the leaders of the strike. Not the leader, but one of the leaders. And my father always told the story, and he said how they were arrested by the Tsarist police, because this was Russian Poland then, under the Tsar. They arrested and he described how he, as a 6-year-old boy, watched his father being taken in shackles, and the punishment in those days where they forced you to walk on foot back to your village of origin. See, many of the people living in Lodz had immigrated or had moved from the smaller outlying surrounding villages into Lodz, where you had industry and they became workers and so on. This was part of the process taken. And he had to move back to his home stable, a real stable, in kegn, in chains. And this was a story I always remembered. And so that was part of our tradition. In other words, my grandfather, the pride that we had in my grandfather who led the strike, the first strike of Jewish workers in Lodz, 1903, that's around the time leading up to the 1905 revolution. So that's part of our tradition.
Okay, a few details are just ever so slightly off. 1902 and not 1903. The family name depends on pronunciation of the Jewish, I might add, the Jewish bosses at the factory. But what I want to emphasize is that this is the backdraft of a life. By draft, I mean the tailwind that propels a life, and that for a man of 82 at the time, it's also the way he really wants to regenerate his life, to begin his life with a family legend that is a source, he says, of pride. Now, the old man, or I should say the not so old grandfather, is being taken off as a prisoner, first in shackle, and then second time around in kegn, in chains. If you were to go to the penultimate line of the Communist Manifesto in Yiddish, you would see that the workers of the world who have nothing to lose but their chains, there's the same word, of course, in kegn. There's honor, of which is the source of pride when Grandpa is arrested, not shame, not a bit. That momentum and that kind of story repeated itself over and over again, and I talked to enough people to make it less than an accident or a random sample. Bill Sussman, who told me right off the bat, I was born to go to Spain. What does it mean when a person says, I was born to do something? It certainly means something that precedes birth, and I don't just mean sex. Again, it becomes familial, and I would like to say grandparental. Look at this photo. He showed me the picture that he had retained across his life. This particular image was in the collection of his widow, who died while I was working on the book. The last survivor of the people I spoke to was Bill Sussman's wife, Helene. Here, the little boy on the lap of the old man. The old man was commonly called Der Zede, the grandfather of Yiddish socialism, both in Eastern Europe, and then in London, and then in New York. Morris Winchevsky. He was not the grandfather in this family, but he was the symbolic grandfather of the movement. And as you see him now, the little boy wearing, incidentally, a Russian blouse, recollection of the recent revolution, this is 1922, is seated surrounded by his own family, brother, mother, and father, and symbolic grandfather, by this time, incidentally, Morris Winchevsky was a member of the Communist Party. When I spoke to Abe Smorodin, we can look at the next slide, and I'll read something that Abe told me. He says, and this is, we're showing this as, in a way, characteristic, although each person has his own flavor, accent, intonation, very distinct one person from another, but the life experience has common ground. So we can look at this as representative. I was brought up in a left radical home. My mother and father had three passions in their life, aside from their love of their children and that kind of stuff. I like the way he dismisses that kind of stuff. Politically, they were very much involved with the Morgenfreiheit. They were deeply involved in the Schule movement. Notice my pronunciation, Schule instead of Schul, plural, Schules. I don't mean shoe without shoes. Is something that several people insisted on. It means, obviously, a school, but the Schule is a secular school to be distinguished from Schul. So at one point, I could ask, I think this guy, I say, so your parents supported the Schule? Did they go to Schul? And he would pick up the difference. He says they were involved in the Schule movement. You know what that is? They were ardent members of the IWO. All three were Jewish in nature. Interesting thing is that their support of the Freiheit, which you'll find to be true of a large part of its readership over the years, is that they were literally taking food right off the table of their family for this little paper. As a matter of fact, they were so ardent in their support of that struggle. They were ardent in support of that struggle was not exactly their ardor, a class struggle, so to speak. It was also a struggle between the Morgenfreiheit and the Yiddish Vorwärts. To my parents, the Vorwärts, which was the organ of right-wing social democrats, was not only wrong politically, but it was a betrayer of the Yiddish language. They were polluting with Americanisms. If you wanted the true classical literary language, you would only find it in the Morgenfreiheit. And I like the way political diatribe shifts to a linguistic diatribe, which incidentally would have been conducted with the same degree of passion at the time. Yiddishkeit, Yiddish language, association with the language was interlocking and embedded in political affiliation for the generation of the parents and grandparents, less so of the young people, the 20-year-olds who went to Spain. But this is what they came from. This is where they started. And incidentally, this passage, when you see it in the book, the context is his description of his own grandfather, his Zeta, as he calls him, who was not political, who was very pious, living with them. He said, we lived in mutual respect for his piety and the piety of my parents, which was political and linguistic. The Yiddishkeit of the international brigade came home to me in a way that strangely, and I really mean strangely, I didn't know until I met veterans who responded positively to my family name. As you see, the one company in the Lincoln Brigade that was permitted to use Yiddish as its official language, publish a paper in Yiddish, mount theatrical performances, was the Butwin. The Butwin company of the Polish Brigade was entirely Jewish, Yiddish speaking, got their name from a martyr of the cause who had been executed in Lvov in 1925, Naftali Butwin. It's exactly my family name, and I can't claim direct relationship, but spiritual relationship yet. Now, if you add all of this together and then look at the picture that's actually on the cover of Saludi Shalom, of the book, you see, first of all, a host of Jewish faces. The picture, which incidentally comes out of the library at Champaign-Urbana, and the book is published by the University of Illinois Press. The picture is in the collection of Edwin Roll, poet, who's in the picture, man wearing a beret, third row up on the right. The number of Jews in the picture, and they've all been identified, is about the same, 11 out of 33. The 1/3 percentage of Jews in the battalion. The picture itself is framed by George Watt, whose grandfather began his career in chains, is the man in the uniform on the left. Joe North, lower right, was a journalist with with Communist Press, and right next to Joe North, lower right, you see a black soldier, Joe Taylor of Griffin, Georgia, reading the Morgenfreiheit, or at least he's looking at the Morgenfreiheit. The Yiddish press is once again, and here more symbolically than really probably, integrated into the self-portrait of the Lincoln Brigade. What I want to ask, after Ben carries this further into the Yiddish press, can we, on the basis of what I've just said, can we call the International Brigade, or more specifically the Lincoln Brigade, part of a Jewish crusade in Spain? Putting aside the obvious irony of the word crusade and linking it to Spain. Is this a Jewish crusade? I want to suggest yes, but I'm afraid I also want to suggest no. And we'll get back to the other side of the story after Ben has carried it more deeply into the Yiddish press.
Yes. So Joe's book and conversations with Joe inspired me to look more deeply into the Morgenfreiheit specifically, to look at how during the period of the Spanish Civil War, and even beginning before the Spanish Civil War with the parliamentary elections in February of 1936, how prominent a role this developments in Spain played in the Morgenfreiheit, so in this left-wing Yiddish newspaper. So in looking at the digitized editions of Morgenfreiheit from this period, I mean, right on the front page, lots of stories popped out immediately. So in February of 1936, during the election, we have here on the left side, Volksfront gewinnt Mehrheit in Spanischen Parlament. The Popular Front wins majority in the Spanish Parliament. And so that was on February 19th, 1936. So they're clearly following political developments. And so for any family that subscribes to the Morgenfreiheit, they would have been following along as the paper covered these events in Spain. And as Joe points out in his book, in looking at the Daily Worker, the English Communist Party newspaper, there's a parallel tracking of events in Spain. And so when hostilities and military conflict begins in July of 1936, we have another headline: Spanische Regierung unterdrückt monarchistischen Revolt in Morocco. So the Spanish government suppresses monarchist revolt in Morocco, which, as Joe pointed out to me, this was a sort of optimistic headline at the beginning of the conflict. And it's also interesting to think about the resonances of these kinds of headlines for today as well. It was hard for me not to think, for example, of the recent No Kings protests in the United States when I was reading about democratic government trying to suppress a monarchistic revolt. And indeed, developments in the United States and development in Spain were tracked in parallel in the newspaper. And you can see right underneath this top headline, another subheadline, which reads, Reichtum ist der Diktatur von Amerika, sagt Ickes. Wealth is the dictatorship of America, according to Harold Ickes, in the Roosevelt administration. And this would have been just about a month after Roosevelt gave a famous speech in which he decried the economic royalists, the monopolists, and so forth. And so I think it's interesting to see the affinities between how these events are being covered in the Yiddish press and what the kind of political rhetoric that's in the air in the English languages. And I think this reflects the Popular Front idea, and this idea of a broad coalition against monarchism, against authoritarianism, against dictatorship, against fascism, and obviously an attempt here on the part of the left-wing Yiddish press to connect that with a broader critique of capitalism and the hoarding of wealth and so forth. So following along in the paper, you can see these illustrations from the left-wing Jewish artist William Gropper, who's a famous artist who he drew cartoons that were in Vanity Fair. They were published in New Masses, and also he regularly contributed cartoons to the Morgen Freiheit starting in the 1920s, about 10 or so cartoons a week from what I understand over a long period. He's a really prolific cartoonist. And I think these are just wonderfully dramatic images, which again, if you look at them in the context of the paper, you see how connected they are to the stories that are being reported in the newspaper. So on the left here, we have the serpent and the savior, der Schlange and der Retter, the Spanish workers rising up in a gigantic form to fight against fascism, represented by this serpent. And on the right, help the Spanish Republic against the fascist murderer, help der Spanische Republik gegen den faschistischen Mörder. And you see General Franco standing on top of this this kind of Nazi robot hand, which I think clearly symbolizes what Joe was talking about when he was giving us some context for the Spanish Civil War. This is, the military and technological support being given to Franco and these reactionary forces by the governments of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. And again, as Joe was saying, at first the material support for the Spanish Republic from the Soviet Union was sort of old-fashioned kind of arms and so forth. And so opposed to this kind of Nazi robot hand, we have these human fists rising up to resist Franco, who's depicted, in this graphic style as skeletal, as representative of death, with his sword and with his gun. And so I just thought these were really fascinating examples of what it would have been like to read the left-wing Yiddish press during this period. And you can start to kind of connect the dots between the homes of eventual volunteers who subscribe to the newspaper, and you can perhaps get yourself into the mindset that they might have been in when they volunteered to go to Spain. And the last image that I found was of La Pasionaria Dolores Ibarrari, Spanish member of parliament and famous orator during the Spanish Civil War, who gave really well-reported speeches. And this is from July 28th, 1936. And this is a whole profile about her and her life and her activism. Passionaria Tochter von Spanischen Miner, eine von die größte Führer in die Schlachten gegen Fascism. Passionaria, daughter of a Spanish miner, one of the greatest leaders in the battle against fascism. So you can see, how closely events were being followed, and not only that, but how sort of deeply into individual characters the Morgan Freiheit wanted to dive in order to give their readers a sense of what was happening in Spain. And I think this just, it bolsters the case for understanding the participation of Jewish volunteers as part of a Jewish crusade, I guess you could say. But as Joe will now, I think, explain, that is not all of the story. And if we want to understand them as participating in some kind of Jewish crusade, we also have to understand the non-Jewish motivations that were at work. So I'm gonna stop the presentation here and let Joe take over again.
Yeah. Incidentally, one of the pictures with which we began, which was the Robert Capa photo of the three leaders and the battalion at their back, that was taken in Catalonia a few days before they arrived in Barcelona. The Spanish Republic decided in October of 1938 to ask the international brigades to leave the country. They had, turns out, a rather naive impression that that might make Hitler and Mussolini on their side do the same, and of course it didn't. But the brigades left through Barcelona, and La Pasionaria, whom we've just seen in 1936, famously spoke to them as they left the country, telling them what? You are history, you are legend, and saying that when you return, you'll be honored, meaning that when Franco falls, there will be honor. Many of them did return later. Many of them were honored, but Franco himself didn't fall until his death in 1975. The war was effectively lost by the time the brigades left at the end of 1938. It wouldn't end officially until the spring of 39. Now, to look more closely at the question of whether we are, with all of this armament is a metaphor there. I meant pictures, personal accounts, personal histories, devotion to Yiddish language and literature and politics, particularly on the part of parents and grandparents, might equip us to Judaize the international brigades across the board and the American group under that heading that slippery heading that I've introduced as a Jewish crusade. Well, not quite, at least not according to the men and women themselves. Saul Wellman describes, one of the vets, describes a meeting with international vets in Tel Aviv in 1972, where many of the people present had been recently Jews, veterans of the Spanish Civil War, evicted from, particularly from Poland, recent arrivals in Israel. So it was an appropriate place for vets to get together. And Saul argues with them about the degree to which Jewishness matters when they talk about their shared political affiliation in the 1930s. He says, we went to Spain because we were anti-fascist, trade unionists. In other words, there were 8 reasons for going to Spain. The Jewish part was one of the 8, and it was the bottom. And incidentally, he invokes the word that we built into the title of today's presentation, anti-fascist. Others would say in their self-identification and in their defense, I didn't go as a Jew, I went as an anti-fascist, as an internationalist. And I might say that one word that they're dodging isn't simply the word Jew or Jewish, but revolution and revolutionary. The nature of the Popular Front and of the American, particularly the American Communist Party, by the mid-30s was that it was not presenting itself as a revolutionary party. And in Spain, the emphasis on anti-fascist was to be and to remain to this day controversial. That would take us in another direction. Why would they dodge the concept of revolution that had attracted so many of them to the party in the first place? In the mid-30s, that was tamped down, particularly in Spain, on the part of the Communist Party, not on the part of all Spanish Republicans. I'll look at one detail that is prevalent, common enough to suggest this tamping down, I'm not going to worry about the revolutionary impulse at this point, of Jewishness. How many people anglicized their names? You may say that that was done across the immigrant population, but the Communist Party had a particular penchant for the Anglo-Saxon in self-identification. George Watt, with whom I began today, and who generated my project, not single-handedly, but was certainly one of the reasons I was there in the first place, was Israel Kvat. Kivkatsky originally became Kvat in America, first name Israel, Izzy to his friends. Bill Sussman, who we see sitting on the lap of Morris Winchevsky, went to Spain as Bill Ellis and retained that name for several years after. Joe North, who's the communist journalist in the lower right of the group photo on the cover of the book, was Jacob Seifer, born in Ukraine. Edwin Rolfe, the poet whose collection includes that picture and whose papers are very beautifully maintained in Champaign-Urbana, was Solomon Fishman. Now, it wasn't true for all of the vets or all of the people I spoke to. Abe Smorodin, whose parents were devoted to the Morgenfreiheit and the Schule, was adamant when I asked him, was he ever tempted to change his name? He said, people wanted to call me Al. They didn't like Abe. I said, look, Abe, it was good enough for Lincoln. It's good enough for me. He was kind of a very refined roughneck. And not very refined and very rough was Abe Osheroff, who also resisted the encouragement on the part of the party, especially when it went to people who were likely to be in leadership, to change their names and submerge their Jewishness. Abe Osheroff said, they thought that A.B. Osheroff couldn't talk to the steel workers. He then throws out a few expletives and said that he was willing to arm wrestle or fight with the steel workers to gain their respect, and he could have held his own. I mean, he did hold his own, I'm sure, but he wasn't going to stop being Abe Osheroff. It's also true that these two men began their political lives and their organizational lives in intensely Jewish neighborhoods in Brooklyn, where their Jewish names would not pose a problem. In the population at large, the degree of anti-Semitism in America, I don't have to elaborate, was such that a Jewish identity, a Jewish name, was a burden. And that was equally true in the Communist Party and the Communist Party's impression of the American worker. Could the American worker follow a Jew who was inevitably a recent immigrant or the son or daughter of recent immigrants? Saul Wellman said that changing the name, and he didn't change his, would at the very least eliminate the strain of anti-Semitism. And all of them have something to say about that strain. They were afraid that they couldn't appeal to American workers as Jews. In addition, the Communist Party had very Americanist policy in the late 30s. Earl Browder, the head of the party, famously said, and he was obliged to retract it not long afterwards, that, where did it go? Communism is 20th century Americanism. Not clear how many people found that an acceptable statement, but it was also a way to appeal to American traditions. Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, the Declaration of Independence, all of them become part of Browder's explanation of why communism is now 20th century Americanism. It has a history in America. And that was a way of putting at a distance the public impression, not entirely inaccurate, that communism was an import, that it was the program of recent immigrants. American immigration policy had become very strict, and I might add very racist, 100 years ago in 1924. And we're seeing a revival of the same language, same impulses, I'm afraid, today, all very recognizable, ways in which the lives of recent immigrants could become, were often burdensome and a burden to the party. To that, I want to add the charm of internationalism. The possibility that in entering an international brigade, going to fight the good fight, so to speak, as an anti-fascist with comrades of all nations, would create for the first time in their lives, in many cases, a strong sense that they were, in the words of the song called L'Internationale, members of what the song calls in its original French, le genre humain, the human race, just a human being like others. A category that a number of them raised was citizen of the world. Eugene Debs, in prison in 1916, said that he had lost his American citizenship. He didn't care. He was a citizen of the world. And I think the charm, as I say, of entering into that citizenship can't be minimized. And it really initiated so many of my conversations. I didn't go as a Jew. I went as an internationalist, an anti-fascist. In other words, this is not a Jewish crusade, if it's a crusade at all. It's an international one. And Jews, to say Jewish would also bring a little too much of a kind of a localization, another form of nationalism that most of them would at that time have shed. Now, why were they so ready after making these initial announcements to talk to me even, and to talk so extensively about their Jewishness? I could rattle off a bunch of bullet points, and I'll do it very rapidly, to suggest that there was an erosion of that internationalist optimism on the part of communists who would become ex-communists, at least by the 1950s, over the period after the Spanish Civil War. 1939, the pact, the Nazi-Soviet pact, which would permit, on the part of a communist party, the communist party in Moscow, would permit the occupation of most of Poland, including Warsaw, where people like my own grandparents came from. 1942 to 45, the Holocaust, not knowledge in 1936, 37, 38. A number of the vets whom I spoke to served in the American Army after entered the camps as a liberator and saw the consequence of an anti-Semitism that he might have minimized 6-7 years before. Increased his sense of the difficulty of Jewish integration into the genre humain when they were excluded to that degree and executed. The first flush of the State of Israel in 1948, Soviet Union, one of its major supporters at that time, Czechoslovakian arms, its armament. Within months at that time, Stalin launched a foul anti-Jewish campaign against the so-called doctors' plot. By 1952, he had seen to the murder of most members of what had been called the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee that had visited New York in 1943 and been welcomed to raise funds to support the Red Army. The vendetta against Jews was launched and often sustained by the accusation of cosmopolitanism, not sufficiently Russian. Bill Sussman, the guy on Vinchevsky's lap, said to me, cosmopolitanism, what's the problem? I'm a cosmopolitan, I'm proud of that. Internationalism turned out to be a betrayal in Stalin's eyes by the end of his career. After his career, Nikita Khrushchev in 1956 spilled the beans, admitted the excesses of Stalinism, and there was a mass migration out of the party after that on the part of the people who should have known much of what Khrushchev said already, but they had never heard it from Moscow, never from the top of the party. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and I began to enter their kitchens and living rooms a few weeks later. That and their age, they were all, I'll have to say, the age I am now. The time for reflection, retrospection. They wanted to talk about their lives, and they were ready to do so with a willing audience. And I have to suspect that my presence in the room, I was the age of their children, never mind that I was 50 years old and no child at that time, 30 years ago. But I was also a Jew, self-consciously bringing to them a personal history of that inevitably yoked Yiddishkeit with the politics that they had, that we also had shared. They were ready to talk, and I was ready to listen. And I don't doubt that I altered the experiment somewhat in ways that I found enormously gratifying. It really is. I can say, if I get reflective about my own life, a high point was sitting down, getting to know, talking, winning the confidence, I think, I hope, of people who warmed up to the event. And now it was really with my own retirement that I refound the tapes, the cassettes, and had to face the fact that everybody that I spoke to had died, and this was a way, humbly, to revive them and their voices. We heard one of those voices today, but reading the book brings, and brought for me last week when I reread it, brings them all back to life. Okay. I would say to Ben and to anybody else, any questions?
Thank you very much, Joe. That was a perfect note to end on. And thank you so much for such a stimulating discussion and lecture. I have a few questions, but we have about 15 minutes left. I want to invite anybody in the audience. If you have a question, please, I think you can raise your hand via Zoom, but also I think we're a small enough group right now that anybody who has a question. Okay, I see one question from Stephen Eisenman. Stephen, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thanks very much. That was a terrific presentation. I really enjoyed it and I learned a lot, and I'm grateful to you for giving it. One thing you didn't speak about, but which I heard about so much when I first began to hear about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, was that it was a suicide mission, that it was a madness, a marvelous, idealistic madness, but a kind of madness. Did that come up in your conversations? Is that part of your understanding of it as well,
Yes.
or what?
Yes. At one point, for instance, I asked somebody, one of the guys, and incidentally, I say guys, I spoke to women too. The women were medical workers rather than warriors, and they were the only people who went to Spain knowing what they were doing. In other words, with training and previous experience in the medical profession. But in any case, to one of the guys, I asked if international brigades were largely symbolic. In other words, a way of enlisting global attention when the major democracies were turning away from them. He said, maybe, but not symbolic. We were, as he said, and as you were suggesting, we were shock troops. Immediately at Jarama, the first who arrived were just pushed in to fill the gap, and a stunning number of them were killed. A third of the American volunteers were killed. That's way beyond any percentage in, say, World War II. They were poorly equipped, barely trained, and over again, Bill Sussman would say, look, I knew that I was going to die there. The moment he got there, I knew. Everybody I spoke to was wounded, some seriously, except, strangely, Abe Smorodin, this sweet little guy who loves opera and spoke with animation about the public library. He was blind in one eye. He wasn't accepted by the American Army. He fought in every major, at the front, every major battle without being wounded. His comrades noticed that because the odds were definitely against them. So it's hard to know what to do with that. What their enemies did with that was to say that they were cynically exploited dupes. And everybody I spoke to rejected that notion and somehow or another maintained those ideals, even though they knew a lot about Soviet cynicism. The Soviet Union received many of its veterans by executing them. They had been polluted by their internationalism, by their exposure to foreigners when they went back to Moscow. So the field is cluttered, and it's not entirely helped by too much sweetness and light. Most of these people winced at the expression "the good fight." One of them frankly said there's a lot of bullshit in the idealization, say, of the Communist Party at the time. That's why I don't mind answering a question about was it this or that by saying it was both. Anybody else, or any further question there?
We did get another question in through the chat from Dottie Fiedler, who asked, I think, a very simple question, but one that I think is really important, which is why was it called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade?
Good question, and you'll notice at the very beginning I hemmed and hawed when I said the group commonly known as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. First of all, the Americans were indubitably the only brigade among the internationals who named themselves after national heroes and presidents. All of the others borrowed their names, like the Butwins and the Dobrovskis and Tileman Brigade, from communist martyrs, from revolutionaries and rebels and such. So it's part of the Americanization of the Popular Front in that period. Listen when this ends to Paul Robeson singing the Ballad for Americans. Listen to Abe Lincoln in Illinois, the radio production that was made at the time. There was initially a Washington, no less, a Washington and a Lincoln battalion, not brigade. The Washingtons were decimated, actually more than decimated, which means only 1/10, in first combat, including Jarama. So they were yoked to the Lincolns, and the Lincoln became a primary name. But half the people I spoke to weren't in either Washington or Lincoln. They were in the Canadian Mackenzie Papineau battalion, which absorbed Canadian recruits who weren't as numerous as the Americans. So a lot of Americans were shunted into the MacPaps, as they were called. And incidentally, Mackenzie and Papineau were rebels against British imperialism in the 1830s. They weren't prime ministers of Canada or regal presences in Canada. But when they returned to America, they became almost instantly veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. And the word brigade was maintained somewhat falsely, and Abraham Lincoln as a blanket title. So it became more relevant after the fact than during the turmoil of the war itself. But I would stress the importance of the intense association with American history, the liberation of the slaves, and everything and why Abe Smrodin could say, Abe, it was good enough for Lincoln, it's good enough for me. Yeah, any other?
I see Sandy Gerber has her hand up. Sandy, go ahead.
Well, first, I just want to thank you for just such a wonderful presentation. And as you were talking, it just reminded me of the power of a concept like international brigades. I was on the something called the Venceremos International Brigade in 1970, and we went to Cuba along, and there were delegations from Angola, the liberation anti-colonial movements from Angola and Zimbabwe and South Africa, North Korea, and we were all there to participate in a huge sugar harvest of 10 million arrobas of cane to advance the Cuban Revolution. And we cut sugar cane from morning till night every day for 6 weeks and traveled the island. And I was 21 years old when I set foot there, and it influenced the entire direction of my whole life. And I guess when you were talking about internationalism and the idealism and participating in that type of an effort, I guess I just wanted to thank you for affirming what the power of that can be on the people that you interviewed and just in my own life.
I completely not only recognize what you're saying about about your experience in Cuba, but it's the kind of thing that came up in my conversations, because when I met these people in 1991, one of the reasons that I had renewed an interest, which, as I say, may have begun in my childhood, was that I had worked with a number of vets of the Spanish Civil War in and around Nicaragua. And I made my own trip to Nicaragua, where incidentally, any 5-year-old Nicaraguan can pick more of those pesky coffee berries than, a Jewish English professor. But again, around Nicaragua and earlier in Cuba, that broad global camaraderie was part of the point. And the vets of Spain kind of renewed their activism around movements of that kind And incidentally, I would say to all of them, because I found it incredible in the true sense of that word, not capable of belief that anybody would ever volunteer to go to war. I would always tell them I did everything I could to avoid going to a war when I was their age, when I was in my 20s, and that war was Vietnam. They all wholeheartedly agreed with me. And every one of them acknowledged that war is hell and a terrible thing to do or to have to do. But most of them understood why in their time they had to do it.
I see another hand, Sarah Cohen. Go ahead.
A question about the use of battalion and brigade.
First of all, I want to say that something I would say to the people I spoke to. Ben used the term that I've used all along when he introduced me, that these are life stories. These aren't war stories, they're life stories. So I would tell right off the bat, I would let people know that I'm not a military historian. I didn't exactly avoid talking about the war, but I recognize that much that they learned at the front, from a technical point of view, I wouldn't understand, and it's been done exceedingly well by historians who know how to do it. So brigade and battalion, one's bigger than the other. A battalion is part of a brigade, and a company is part of a battalion. So when I say that the Butwins, the ones that bear my family name, were a company in a particular battalion of a Polish brigade, or of the international brigades, the Polish battalion within the brigades, I'm simply, well, never so simple that I completely understand it, talking about the the inverted triangular structure of military command and terminology, so that you can hear in the songs of the Spanish Civil War, Viva la Quince Brigada, Quince Brigada includes a variety of battalions.
All right, we have maybe time for just one more quick question, if anybody has one, but we're just about at 3:30 here. Well, maybe I'll ask just for the last few moments we have, Joe. Maybe if I could ask you, since this is the Chicago YIVO Society, what do you think the long-term effects of the use of Yiddish were? For the veterans, how growing up in Yiddish speaking milieu would have affected their sense of identity and affected their participation in the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah, again, partially because I prevaricate all the time, and I think that means something a little close to avoid taking positions. Partially because there isn't a clear answer to any of these questions. But on this one, I would say that the paradox built into, for instance, for so many of them, Yiddish education, and I mean not just native speakers at home, but in the schools, Yiddish socialist schools and such. I asked one of the guys, so you heard all of these principles spoken in Yiddish. He had said that he had the impression that all the leaders of the revolution must be Jewish because they all spoke such perfect Yiddish. In other words, he heard them quoted by his parents and teachers. So I asked, so in this world that you're imagining, will it be a Yiddish world? And he said, oh, no, not at all. George Watt's father sends him to Yiddish school and tells him, you've got to learn Yiddish because it's my language. That's how we will communicate. But your children may not need it. And they were already anticipating its decline. George Watt incidentally wrote home to his parents in Yiddish, but he said rather wistfully, and I'm actually sort of sad to say and maybe betray him. He said of his own grandchildren, as I was leaving the house, he said, geez, I don't even know if they know they're Jewish. That's on one side. The possible, even in the revolutionary vision, the evaporation of their own language. You have to reflect on that possibility. Against that was, first of all, the relish that they all took in using it and in appealing to me in my thin knowledge of Yiddish. And then a line that I quote in my introduction from Horace Callan, an American sociologist who took part in the hot debate around immigration in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. He wrote a book called Democracy versus the Melting Pot. He preferred democracy. And what democracy meant for Horace Callan in 1915 was a multicultural America. And he says at one point, knowing that these immigrant generations are going to have to learn English and that their offspring, which would be the people I interviewed, would have to master English to make their way, the old folks may participate in a multicultural America, which in 1915 it was, but that in the next generation might disappear. But then he says, and you can almost imagine a Jew saying this, says, a man can change his philosophy, his politics, I might say that he has his wife, his livelihood, but he can't change his grandfather. And as I listened to those people talk, and as I looked to myself, what did I do when I retired? Well, first of all, I wrote this book, but also I began once again to dig into the Yiddish language on my own. I think it may be time for me to take a course with Chicago Yibo. But all of them spoke of their grandparents. You can't change your grandfather. That suggested to me, and something that I've seen in universities that have departments of Yiddish, in organizations like Chicago Yibo in New York, the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, the vivid in musical production, the vivid affinity that so many people have now to the Yiddish language. I think that's the direction. And there, I'm inclined to be positive, not just shilly-shallying on the fence where I usually live. And that's part of my delight in the invitation that Ben extended to me to talk with you all today. It's where I want to be.
Well, thank you, Joe. That's just a fabulous note to end on. And thank you, everyone, for attending and for participating and for your excellent questions. And once again, take a look at chicagoyivo.org for Yiddish classes, for upcoming events. And so we hope to see you at one of those soon. And of course, a tremendous thanks to Joe for talking with me, for putting this incredible lecture together. Incredible. I guess I use it in the slightly inflated Trumpian sense of incredible, truly amazing and superlative lecture. Yeah, we hope to see you at another Chicago Yivo event soon. So I'll say to all of you, seid gesund and stark. Bye-bye.